Hello and welcome to Madison Central School TC3 biology page. Today we're going to be talking about community ecology, which is the next step in our progression through our units. Community ecology, you're dealing with all the populations in an area that live together and interact with each other. They have to be able to interact or they're not part of the community. It's a study of all the organisms in that area. So it's a little more complex in population ecology, but it's not as complex as getting into ecosystems, which would be the next level, where now you're including some abiotic factors as well. If you're looking at the populations, for example, down here in the picture on the bottom right, you're looking at African savanna, and there are springbuck there, and a couple of other things look like antelopes. There are birds there. There are probably predators in the water that we can't see. All of those interactions are important in the overall understanding of the ecology of these communities. The first thing we have to talk about is the concept of a niche. Basically, it's its role in its ecosystem. So when you're looking at an organism's niche, you're looking at what it eats, what eats it, how it interacts with the non-living pieces of the ecosystem, and whether or not it can modify the ecosystem in some ways. Basically, every organism has that kind of impact where you find it. The habitat then is considered like its home, its physical address, where it's found most of the time throughout its life. And then the niche would be considered its job in that habitat. So this leads us to a discussion of what's called the competitive exclusion principle. You have two species in an ecosystem, their niches will overlap a little bit. And as a result of that, there is competition between the two organisms in that ecosystem to the point at which one of the two species will have to shift their niche because it's being outcompeted by the other one. In some cases, this causes extinctions, as species 1, for example, is outcompeted by species 2, and then species 2 takes over and species 1 is gone from that ecosystem. So you have a concept here of fundamental niche. The fundamental niche is the entire width of the ecosystem that a species can use. The realized or recognized niche is the actual piece that they do use because of competition. If they're excluded from certain parts of the niche, then that's their realized or recognized niche. In this case, in this picture, you're looking at barnacles, and the competition happens at water lines, certain depths. You'll find one species of barnacle that can be found all throughout the whole thing. And then you'll find the other species of barnacle, which is usually mostly the deeper waters. And the species 2 in this case is actually able to outcompete species 1 at the deeper depths. So that is its realized niche, even though it could go all the way to the top of the water column. You also have speciation as a result of this. You'll see two species be kind of split off. In this case, we're looking at the tiger and the lion. You don't find them in the same ecosystem because they share too much of the same niche. So because of competition ages ago, and we're talking thousands, if not millions of years ago, these two species split off and they partitioned into different niches. So you don't see the tiger where you see the lion and vice versa, because that would be too much competition for the species. They have evolved into these different ecosystems. Resource partitioning is, if you look at an ecosystem, there will be small ecoregions within each ecosystem that can be used by different organisms. It's an interesting concept in that if you look here, we're looking at green anoles. They're a little green lizard that sometimes people call the American chameleon. They are found in the South and in some pet stores. They don't if you're looking at them, you may not recognize that you're looking at different species of them, but they all have slightly different realized niches in the trees that they live in and around. You have some that live down near the ground, like Etheridgii. You have some that live in high up in the trees, like Recordii. And as a result, they are not competing with each other in these ecosystems. And therefore, they can have vibrant populations at these different places. So this is a function of reducing competition. It's not like they thought that they wanted to do it, but over time it happened, and they've evolved into these different microhabitats within the forest, and they don't tend to compete much because they always forage for food in the same areas. Now, there are 4 specific types of interspecies interactions that happen that are considered symbioses. You might argue that parasitism is not truly a symbiotic reaction or interaction, because symbiotic, some people think of it as positive interactions only, but the truth is they are also negative interactions, because sim means same and biotic, bios means living. So they're living in the same area and they're interacting with each other, sometimes in a positive fashion and sometimes in a negative fashion, depending on your point of view. The first one is competition. Competition is a very incredibly strong driver of evolution. They're competing for limited resources, and so you see competitive exclusion in these places. It is negative for both species, because any type of competition reduces the population's ability to gather energy. Then the next one is parasitism or predation. In predation, an organism kills and consumes another organism. And so as a result of that, it's positive for the predator who is getting food, but it's definitely not positive for the prey who is being eaten. Parasitism, you're looking at things like ticks and fleas, mosquitoes. They draw energy from a host, so it's positive for the parasite, but negative for the host. Mutualism is positive for both of them. Mutualisms are really a lot more common than we think of. When you look around, you'll see them in different places. If you've ever seen lichens growing on trees, it's a mutualism between algae, which you don't think of growing on trees, but it does if it's a lichen, and a fungus, which is there, trying to feed, and the algae inside of it gives it energy. But also, the fungus is providing a safe place for the algae to live. There are a lot of different kinds of mutualisms that are commonly discussed. If you see the bottom picture there, you've got the oxpeckers on the back of they look like Cape buffalo. And the Cape buffalo provides protection for the bird. The bird picks parasites from the Cape buffalo and basically helps limit its irritation due to the parasites. You'll see things like clownfish and anemones. That is a mutualism because they're both benefiting. Now, last one is a little bit harder one to pick out sometimes, because it's hard to identify whether or not both species are being impacted by it. But commensalism, in the case of the whales, the barnacles can grow on the whale, and it gives them a nice place to live. It doesn't really bother the whale, doesn't hurt them. So as a result, this is what we call a commensalistic relationship. The barnacle gets a plus, and the whale isn't harmed. So here are some more examples of all of these. You have some commensalism here. You've got a plant growing on the side of a tree. That's helping the plant, but it doesn't hurt the tree. Predation. You've got a spider there eating a moth. It's obviously positive for the spider and not so good for the moth. Mutualism is the clownfish and the anemone again. And then competition actually is an interesting thing. That's a brown-headed cowbird in that picture. And that bird will lay its eggs in the nests of other birds, typically robins. And then the female robin, who is sitting the eggs, will actually adopt this cowbird baby into their nest. And what will happen is the cowbird grows really fast, and ends up shoving the robin babies out of the nest and killing them, or out competing them in the nest for the food that the mother's bringing back. Actually very common in our area, and in fact, you'll see them flying around right now. So here are a couple of relationships. If you start with the one in the upper left, you've got, it looks like some type of antelope. I'm not sure what, probably a pronghorn or a springbuck. And there are birds picking at it. Is that positive? Positive? Yes. So the birds are getting free meal. They're getting a nice host to protect them, but they're also picking parasites off the antelope there and helping it to avoid the irritation of the parasites. The second picture over to the right there, where the ants are living on the tree. This is a common example. I believe it's an acacia tree. The ants live in holes inside the acacia tree, and the acacia then provides them with a home and some nutrition because they can eat the sap that comes out of the leaves. But when an herbivore comes along and tries to eat the leaves of the acacia, the ants swarm out and attack it and chase it away. So this is another form of mutualism. Both are benefiting. Obviously, the upper right corner, we're looking at, a lioness taking down a zebra. Not good for the zebra, but it's predation because the lioness has killed and is now eating the zebra. And then down in the bottom corner is a bee with a flower. Again, this is a mutualism. The bee comes and gets the nectar. The flowers produce that nectar that is sweet and good for the bees. They use it for their food. They will pick up the nectar, take it back to their hive, but they also carry pollen from flower to flower, which helps the plants to reproduce. So that's another mutualism. Predation is a very important driver of evolution because there's a lot of adaptation that goes on between the two organisms. And in fact, you'll see sometimes that this is a form of coevolution. As the predators evolve their adaptations to do things like catch their prey and take it down, and get the food, the prey are also evolving adaptations to kind of get away from the predators. So it's a very strong selective force on both. Typical, if you're looking at predators, the typical things that they will focus their adaptations on are, among them, speed, the ability to sense their prey, to find them, and the ability to powerfully take them down so that they can get their food. In the case of the prey, they tend to have things like horns. They can run fast. They can change direction quickly often, and they usually have some kind of coloration that helps them to hide from a predator in different circumstances. So there's different types of adaptations depending on what you're looking at. Some other anti-predator adaptations, these ones are pretty interesting. Camouflage, so they can hide from the predators. They don't get seen as easily. There's a really, really well-documented study about the Biston betularia moth in England and how during the Industrial Revolution, the pollution from the plants had covered the trees and made them a darker color, and the white-colored moths all of a sudden had, less protection because they weren't as well hidden. And so the color morph of those moths has shifted over time, but now it's shifting back because the pollution is dropping. So that's kind of interesting. And then you also have these types of mimicry, which are warning the predators, don't eat me because I'm not going to taste good, or maybe I'll even be poisonous and that'll end up killing you. Monarch butterfly is a very good example of this. They feed on milkweed, which is a powerful toxin inside of it. And if a bird eats a butterfly from the milkweed, it can actually cause them to be very sick, or possibly even stop their heart. So the coloration, that orange color, is an advertisement. Stay away. I'm not tasting good. You don't want me. And this is what we call aposomatic coloration. Apo means away. Somatic means sign. There are two different things that kind of come out of this, and that's Batesian mimicry and Mullerian mimicry, and I'll show you examples of those here. We have other defense mechanisms, camouflage or cryptic coloration. You can see how well these different organisms are matched to their environments. The lizard on the tree, if you were walking by, you may not even see it. The frog, with its coloration, matches its ecosystem. The whippoorwill, really hard to see. There are a lot of examples of this. Here's one of the forms of mimicry. This is Batesian mimicry. So this is the type where a harmless organism will mimic a harmful organism. And in this case, it is the hawk moth larvae, which is just it's a caterpillar, but it can puff up its abdomen. And when it does that, it raises it up. And then it starts to look like this green parrot snake, which is a poisonous snake. So that gives it some protection from birds because the birds will avoid the green parrot snake. And therefore, if the hawk moth larvae looks like a green parrot snake, they'll avoid that too. This is Batesian mimicry here. You've got a monarch male, which is poisonous. And you can tell it's a male, by the way, because of where the arrow is pointing on the wing. That dark spot is indicative of a male monarch butterfly, just in case you didn't know. Over there on the far right, you see the viceroy, which looks just like a monarch, but it isn't. It's got the same coloration as the monarch to make the birds think it's not a good meal for them. And then down to bottom, you've got some flies that mimic bees because obviously the bees have stingers. You've got also a moth that mimics a bee. So these types of mimicries, they're harmless species, but they look like they could be, inedible or harmful. With Mullerian, it's a little different. It's because they look similar. It's kind of the thought is it's a group defense, even though the species aren't evolving in the same way. They've come to this protection the same way. The school bus example is an interesting one of this. If all school buses being yellow gives the kids on the buses more protection because people will, universally, in the United States at least, recognize the yellow bus as a bus coming from a school, and they will allow certain types of protections. Don't pass the stop school bus. So in the case of the cuckoo bee and the yellow jacket, they look very similar, and you'll notice that most bees and yellow jackets have the same coloration. That is a coevolution that is thought to have helped evolve protect them against predators over time. So it's an interesting thing. So more aposematic species here. You've got the frog there, the caterpillar, the monarch caterpillar, the monarch butterfly on the leaf. There's another caterpillar there, which I don't know the species of that one, but with all of these, bright coloration is often in nature a warning. Don't eat this because it's not healthy. And the snake down there is a coral snake, very, very dangerous. So here we have another example. These king snakes, they look like a coral snake, but they're slightly different. And the saying at the bottom, red on yellow, poison a fellow, red on black, safe from attack. That means if you see the stripes on these things and the red is on the black, it's a king snake, and it's not a dangerous snake. I mean, they're kind of ornery, but they aren't going to hurt you. In fact, they are predators of poisonous snakes. So that's kind of an interesting thing too. Now, a coral snake, on the other hand, that would do you no good if you try to pick that up and it bit you. They're very poisonous. So coevolution, you'll see a lot of different examples of coevolution in the world. Predator-prey relationships, I've already talked a little bit about this. As the predator evolves, so does the prey, or the other way around. If the prey evolves a way to avoid the predator evolves a way to find the prey again. It's kind of the whole survival of the fittest illustration everybody has heard of in their life. Parasite and host relationships, the same thing. Parasite has to be able to get into its host in order to survive. If that host evolves a way to avoid being infected by the parasite will find a different mode of infection, usually. And actually, what's happening right now with the coronavirus is a really good example of how evolution can change a virus. Viruses can evolve at a really rapid rate, and that picture up there in the corner is a type of coronavirus. They change the way they attack cells by changing a single protein on their outer coat sometimes, and that's all it takes to get them, to a whole new range of hosts that they haven't had before. The flu is incredibly fast at mutating, which is why typical flu shots will only protect you against a few different strains of the flu, because there's no way you can keep up with all of them. Flowers and pollinators, same idea. It's a coevolution. The pollinators know to go to those flowers. They know that there's going to be nectar for them. The pollen is taken to other plants. So it's a very good example of coevolution. So when we're looking at communities, we have to look at a couple of different things here. How the community is structured is really important in a study of it, because you need to know a couple of things. Number one, how diverse is that community in terms of species? It's really important, because this is a really strong indicator of the health of the community. Then you're going to look at the makeup, the composition of that community. Which are the dominant species in there? Which has the highest biomass? Typically, these are going to be your plants, because plants tend to form the base of any food web. Keystone species. So keystone species, that name is derived from when you're building a stone arch. You go up the sides, and at the top, there's a stone that holds the whole thing upright. That is called the keystone. If you pull the keystone, both sides of the arch will collapse. And so that's the same idea with ecosystems. If you pull a keystone species out of there, you may cause collapse of the whole ecosystem, which is obviously not good. And then we have succession, which we'll get to in a minute. It's a very interesting thing. You can actually see it basically in real time if you look around outside. But I'll explain in a minute. So, as I said before, diversity was important. And it's for these reasons here. Greater biodiversity is you have more food resources for organisms in the ecosystem. You have more habitats available, which is always a good thing. And possibly the most important of these is you have more resilience if there's an ecosystem change. So if something changes in that ecosystem, if every organism in that ecosystem is the same species, it doesn't take much to kill them all off, and that's obviously not good. Okay, so species richness is really important in an ecosystem. So the greater number of species you have, the richer the ecosystem is, the better it is, which is one of the reasons why rainforests are considered incredible ecosystems, or coral reefs very important ecosystems, because they're very rich. They've got tons of diversity. So they're very important ecosystems. Here's an idea of monoculturing. Monoculturing is, generally speaking, a bad idea. It works because the farmers can plant huge amounts of crop that's all one culture. But farmers are starting to learn that monoculturing in their fields isn't a great idea. And so they're mixing in different hybrids now, which is better. Still not necessarily the best way to go about things, but farmers are becoming more and more savvy to the science of how the diversity impacts their crops. So if you're looking at these communities here, you've got the agricultural monoculture on the left, and then the old field on the right. Obviously, the old field has a whole lot more species richness. So in terms of ecosystem health, the old field is actually a much more healthy, vibrant ecosystem than the agricultural plot. This is one of the reasons why the Irish potato famine happened, because they were all potatoes of basically one strain, And when the blight hit, it didn't have resistance to that particular blight, and that caused the problem. So that went on until a researcher at University Cal Berkeley came up with hybrid potatoes that were resistant to the blight, and they were able to get that to Ireland and fix the problem. So we'll focus in a little bit on keystone species here. They are really important because they regulate the other organisms in that ecosystem, and they help to keep diversity up. When there's a keystone species present, usually there is a population hierarchy within the ecosystem that is predictable and sustainable. And this is an example here. Pisaster is the sea star that lives off the coast of Washington and Oregon. In that habitat, Pisaster would go around and it would eat the mussels to keep the mussels from outcompeting other organisms in the ecosystem. So when you had Pisaster, the species richness stayed high, but when you took Pisaster away, zebra mussels or other mussels, sorry, not necessarily zebra mussels, but they look a lot like them, the mussels quickly overgrew the entire ocean floor, and that's not good. And this is what they look like. Okay, and they grow in huge patches, but one single sea star would eat its way through this in a day and clear that, and so other organisms were using the habitat, had a place to live. Another example of a keystone species is the sea otter. If you look at the food chain here, where the sea otter is not being preyed on by the orca, the food chain has more diversity to it at the lower levels, which is really important because you need a big, broad base for a food chain in order for it to be healthy. So you've got kelp down there, and the kelp density was good and high because the sea otters were eating the sea urchins that ate the kelp. So, in other words, the sea otters were controlling the urchin population. When the killer whales, the orca, started to eat the sea otters, suddenly the control on the population of the urchins went down, and now the urchin population has shot up, which has caused a decrease in the biomass of kelp, which is not good for the ecosystem because, again, you need that producer at the bottom of the ecosystem for a healthy ecosystem. And so we've seen this in the time since this study had taken place. Obviously, the orca coming in and feeding on these sea otters, which was a new behavior for them, impacted this ecosystem negatively by allowing the urchins to basically take over. The beaver, also a keystone species. They can create new habitats. They're really important in the Northeast and the Northwest. We obviously have plenty of them around our area. They are really important in this habitat production. And so when they were being trapped out, habitats that they would normally be found in were having decreases in species diversity. And so that behavior has been kind of stifled by environmental conservation groups and state regulations, and that has helped the beaver population to come back to where it should be, which is helping to increase diversity in these ecosystems. So now we'll talk about succession. Succession is kind of fascinating because what you have is stable ecosystem, and it can be stable for decades, 1,000 years. And then something happens to change that ecosystem. In 1980, Mount St. Helens exploded. And you can see in the picture on the left, it was just desolation after that because there was this very, very vibrant ecological community around Mount St. Helens before the explosion. The explosion of the mountain basically wiped out this whole ecosystem. You can see down in the foreground, that's Spirit Lake, basically turned into a vat of sulfuric acid and killed all the fish that lived there. It was a very rich ecosystem as well. It took a long time for this to happen, but you can see that in the foreground of the picture on the right, there's a plant called a mountain lupine, and that plant is significant in that it can colonize early ecosystems and grow. And so it's being seen there more and more. Actually, now this picture would be kind of outdated. Now the the scenery is much more lush and green all the way up to the base of the mountain because succession is happening. So what you have with succession is, well, there's two types. There's primary succession and there's secondary. In primary succession, you don't have any soil yet, so you need bacteria, lichens, and mosses to come in and populate. And as they do that, generation after generation after generation of them will do this, and as they die, they decompose into soil. Over time, eventually, you'll get enough soil that grasses can start to grow, and then from there, you go slightly higher, you go to shrubs, which can grow in relatively shallow soil, and then eventually, after shrubs have grown for a couple of 100 years, and their leaves have fallen and decomposed, the leaf litter turns into more soil, and eventually the soil becomes big enough, deep enough that trees can take root, and then the trees start to grow. So this is an example that's being seen in Glacier Bay, where glacier has been receding, leaving behind bare rock. That is an example of a primary succession. New islands coming from volcanic eruptions in the ocean go through primary succession. Anything like this, where the soil has been scraped away or isn't there in the first place because it's a new ecosystem being exposed by things like changes in sea level, can be followed by primary succession. Once there's soil, you can have secondary succession. So in the case of a forest fire, the burning of all the trees wipes out the ecosystem that's there, but not for very long, because what happens then is the nutrients that were locked up in the tree have now been returned to the ecosystem, and the process that comes after the soil is formed in primary succession happens in these ecosystems. So you start with low grasses, you get shrubs, you get smaller trees, and then larger trees, until eventually you get to a very rich ecosystem again with large hardwood trees, if that's appropriate for that climate. So you start with pioneer species. The pioneer species are the lichens, the mosses, the bacteria. You only see pioneer species in primary succession. You don't need them in places where we have soil already. So you start with the pioneer species in primary, and then you go to grasses. Then the grasses start to grow high. You'll then start to see bushes and small trees, and then eventually you'll start to see the taller trees. And again, if it's a hardwood forest area, you'll have pine trees first. The pine trees actually acidify the soil, which makes them unable to grow there anymore, but the larger trees like maples like that soil, and they will then start to outcompete the pine trees with their canopy. And if you think about how a maple tree's canopy is kind of evolved, they're kind of mushroom shaped. They have a tall trunk, and then at the top they've got a large broad canopy that outcompetes pine trees very nicely, because pine trees are conical. They're evolved to resist heavy snows. So in places like around Madison, you won't see stable long-term communities of pine trees because they get outcompeted by the hardwoods that overgrow them. Now, if you were further north, where there's heavier snows and harsher climates in the winter, you see more pine trees. So this is why if you're looking at boreal forests in Canada, they're all pine trees. And so you kind of have to fit the climax community species to the ecosystem. In this case, in our area, the climax community species for forests tend to be things like beeches, oaks, and maples. All right. So succession happens because of a few different reasons. Number one, you have, and we've talked about this before, we talked a little bit about R-selected and K-selected species. The early species are R-selected. They grow fast. They seed and grow really quickly. Low grass can go through several generations in a summer. They're tolerant of harsh conditions, so they can grow in places where the soil isn't great. But as they do that, what's happening is they're facilitating future species, and by changing the soil and increasing the fertility of the soil and changing the light levels at the low parts of the ground, they are fostering changes in the substrate that the plants are growing on, and allowing other species to come in and take over. A lot of the time with this, it's dependent on their ability to gather light. So if they're low to the ground, they're not going to be as good at getting light as taller species that can over canopy them. And you can see in the graph down there on the right kind of how this stuff looks. It's very important to plants to have high levels of nitrogen, at least terrestrial plants, high levels of nitrogen available to them in the forest floor. And as the nitrogen grows, then the species that are there can also grow taller and taller. Then we get to the climax forest. It's a stable plant community. It can last for hundreds and hundreds of years until another disturbance. And typically, like I said, around here, they're hardwoods, tall trees. You do have hemlocks, because hemlocks can grow incredibly tall, and they can stick up through the canopy and get light that way. And some of the white pines, tall pine trees like that. The climax forest can, like I said before, climax forest is different from place to place. You have to match the climax forest to the dominant species that are there, but also to the ecosystem that the forest happens to be in. In a temperate forest area, again, that's what we have around Madison, you're going to have deciduous trees as the dominant species. But if you're further north, as I said before, the abiotic factor of the heavy snow changes that. Lots of disturbances are natural. Forest fire, believe it or not, is a necessary function of habitat rejuvenation in places that many of these fires happen. If you're looking at the Pacific, the West Coast, where they get all these forest fires every year, a big part of why they have the forest fires is because the types of species that live there actually facilitate forest fires in order to help themselves reproduce. Some of the species there, in fact, the pine trees leave a lot of litter on the ground, and it's dry and it burns very easily. But also, some of their seeds won't germinate unless they've been through a fire. So that's an interesting evolutionary trait, a tactic, strategy that allows them to survive with less competition from their offspring until they've been killed by a fire. And then their offspring grow up where they were. So a lot of times, forest fires are nature's way of restoring these ecosystems. It's really not a good thing that humans have chosen to build in these areas where these forest fires basically need to happen to rejuvenate the ecosystem. But unfortunately, they're desirable places for homes for some people. So these are some different types of pines that need fires in order to reproduce. So again, I don't know what I can say about this. We take a lot of effort in kind of keeping forest fires from happening, but one of the things that happens is if you don't let the fire burn, then the litter on the ground builds up over year after year after year, and eventually something's going to happen. A lightning strike, or someone's careless with a campfire, and a small spark turns into a giant fire, like has burned in the last couple of years, several years in the West. And it's partially because we are building our communities in these places that forest fires are kind of naturally high. Okay, so that concludes this session. Hopefully you all were able to fill in your note sheets. You can ask me questions at our next office hour, or you can shoot me an email if you have some things you need to talk about right now. Everybody take care, stay home, stay healthy.